Thank you, thank you. There's this story about a rocket that exploded 30 seconds after launch because of a software bug. I found that very interesting because tying it back to Jonathan's talk this morning, it's our responsibility to make sure everything works securely and well, push the culture. So I'm going to talk about that story and all the lessons we learned from it that still apply to this day. But first, I'm going to give you some context on how I got to that story. So I used to be a security consultant, a penetration tester, and we used tools and Nmap Burp Suite to essentially find bugs and vulnerabilities in web apps or native apps or Wi-Fi, whatever. And really, I was working at a PDF factory. Like, you just work for a week or two, you generate a PDF, you give it to the client, and then after a few years doing that over and over, you realize you're just doing the same thing. You generate a PDF, you give it to the client, you come back the next year, you test the same bugs are still there, no one cares. So I realized, like, what am I missing? There must be more to security than just generating PDFs. And there's a lot more to security. Actually, this is one of my favorite tweets ever. So I realized, wow, like just intrusion detection by itself is a whole field that I knew nothing about. So I started learning about the field, and at a quick glance, how do you make a product more secure, right? Like, going from finding bugs, which is relatively easy, to like, okay, how do we prevent these permanently in the future? Less easy. So actually, there's this really cool book by Kelly Shortridge, who's here. She's talking soon. Huge fan. And this book is really cool. It mentions a few really interesting points. One of my favorite things is resilience is an emergent property of the system as a whole, and it's not just something you can measure by analyzing separate components. And in security, you often just analyze separate components, right? So how do you implement that when you're working? And so let's start with standards and guidelines, like just for the company, for the whole company as a whole. You show intent, like, oh, here are things you could do. Just follow these standards. Helps a little bit. A very important thing I noticed when you move into the defensive side of things is compatibility with engineering culture. So psychological safety, making sure you're not adding friction when working with engineers. Because when there's a security team that's overly strict and they say no to everything, then the engineers just bypass everything they say. Easy, right? Like, then the engineers just go back to doing whatever they want. So it's the same as like not having a security team at all. So how do we maintain a pleasant culture? That's a very important thing. So in security engineering, there's a bunch of different things you can do. Like, one thing, I will talk about this more later, but static application security testing, static analysis, just looking at the code line by line using tools. The next talk is going to be by Adam from SemGraph, which is like my favorite SaaS tool. Also looking at what goes into your software, different components, like looking at secrets that are hard-coded, threat modeling. All of those are important together. So something happened in February this year, earlier this year. I'm not going to give the full context of this photo, but basically I wrote a blog post about this thing. But what actually happened this year is the White House released this paper on like how do you make software more secure, basically, at scale. And they mentioned that the current ecosystem does not sufficiently incentivize the investments required to secure the foundations of cyberspace. The government's using words coined by William Gibson. That's pretty cool. But the three main points they said were these three, like kind of like as a summary. The first one is hardware. I'm just going to skip through this because I work on consumer software, So for example, if you work on Slack, which for some reason this conference, like how do people work at Slack? I don't know. But like if you work on Slack or 1Password or like something that's shipping to clients and you want to support a wide variety of hardware, so sure, the hardware matters for your own infrastructure, but like often you want it to run on like consumer-facing hardware that you can't really control. So skip. Second one, formal methods. Ooh, sounds interesting, right? Like formal methods. What is that? So you're supposed to prove that a program behaves as intended, mathematically creating a model of it. Some compilers and kernels or microkernels have been formally verified. So has anyone here, like in production, used continuous formal verification on their own tools or software? 0 people. 0, right? Yeah, exactly. So actually, I was looking into that. Like, is it even feasible at all to use formal verification like in the industry? And there was one interesting paper by Amazon. So S2N is their TLS library. They use it internally for a lot of things. And they actually had an interesting paper describing how they formally verified that. Like they simplified it a bit, and then they verified part of it, and they rerun automated formal verification in their pipeline. It took a team of, I don't know, was it like 6 people a whole year to get that up and running for like just a small part of their infrastructure. So, I mean, can you like if you like I used to work at Activision. Like let's say like I went and told them like, oh, we need to formally verify Call of Duty. Like what? Like how do you? So yeah, you're proving that the binary is correct, which is like there's also like the underlying infrastructure. There's like so many other things that come in play. My favorite security paper ever is Ken Thompson's reflections on trusting trust. And he's like, oh, what if the compiler is backdoored, for example? Just like formal verification won't really help here. I guess not. But the third and most important part of the White House paper was memory-safe programming languages, which is a very spicy topic nowadays. And basically, Joe Biden made C++ illegal. They said you should rewrite everything in Rust. So actually, you don't have to rewrite everything in Rust. You can start writing some components in Rust, components that matter, and like have interoperability. Like Android does some of that. Again, like let's say like I go to Call of Duty and say, like, oh, rewrite everything in Rust, like what? Like, but I mean, language wars. It's a whole thing. I don't have 2 hours, but let's go into. Oops, this is not working. The clicker is there we go. Let's go into the story of the rocket. So, where should I point it? Oh. Maybe it already is. So we're in 1996. That's the year when Frances McDormand gave her killer performance in the movie Fargo. Tupac was still alive, only for a few more months, but he doesn't know that. We're in French Guyana. We're in a small fishing town called Khoury, which is near the equator. French Guyana because this rocket's being launched by the European Space Agency. And the reason they launched near the equator is because apparently like things spin faster on the equator. Like if you're standing on the North Pole, you're just like spinning real fast in place, so your like velocity is 0, but like on the equator, your exit velocity is faster. So it's just easier to launch a rocket. And today we're launching the Ariane 5. So this is the 5th iteration of the Ariane rocket. So we've had a pretty successful precedent for this particular rocket. It mostly launches like satellites into space. So I don't think any of these had people in them. It's mostly just like other machines being launched. So the cause of the explosion is it's self-destructed. Okay, we know that. Like we fished out the black box from the Guyanese swampland, and we found that the logs say it's self-destructed. Okay, what caused the self-destruct? There's this component on it called the inertial reference system. It was created on the Ariane 5, worked well, and they moved it as it is on. It was created for the 4, and they moved it onto the Ariane 5 as it is. So what it does is, before the rocket actually launches, it measures, it calibrates its trajectory based on accelerometers and a gyro, and it decides if it needs to calibrate its launch velocity for any reason during launch time, or right before, basically. And it feeds that info into the onboard computer or the flight control system. It tells it like, oh, you need to go faster or slower, depending on what it's feeling. And so the logs tell us that a integer overflow happened. So just very quickly, what's integer overflow? So actually, buffer overflow first is when you try to move something from memory into another part of memory that's like smaller than what you're trying to move, so it overwrites other parts of memory. In this case, it was an integer overflow, a different flavor, where it's like a number, and +1, more than the buffer can hold. It wraps around and goes back to 0. So does anyone get this reference? So my favorite story about the integer overflow, actually it's an integer underflow here, what's in the video game Civilization. Gandhi is like the least aggressive leader, but anyone who played Civilization knows that once you discover nuclear weapons, Gandhi nukes everyone. And apparently it was because once you discover nuclear weapons, it sets your aggression level to -1 of what you are, but he's already at 0, so it wraps around and makes him the most aggressive. But actually, it turns out to be a myth. Actually, the developers of the game confirmed like it was actually not an integer underflow. It was like some other bug. But anyway, so integer underflow causes undefined behavior, at least in C and C++, that are now illegal, right? But you can still catch them, right? You can have sanitizers that run on the compiler, and you can try to detect potential undefined behavior. Undefined behavior means we don't know what happens, right? Like, it could be bad, could be not. Like, we don't know. It's not defined how the program should behave. Now, on the rocket, we were using the programming language Ada. Very, very cool programming language, way ahead of its time. Ada had exception handling, had boundary checks, but it was also strongly typed. Basically, Ada could catch, or actually, when you have integer overflow, in C and C++, it's undefined behavior if it's assigned integer, but in Ada, it just raises a constraint error. Okay, so it's an exception. We know how to handle exceptions. We can catch that. It's not a problem. No reason to explode a rocket because of that yet. So the Ariane 4, the previous version, was actually very slow, and the Ariane 5, very, very, very fast compared to the previous version. So because it was so fast, the engineers had taken assumptions of like, oh, during launch, it's never going to be that fast, but it was. And so the inertial reference system, when it was launching at that like really big speed, there was the integer overflow that was calculating the speed, and it detected the operand error. And what do you do when you detect an error in your hardware? When you find an exception, let's kick off the redundant unit, right? Like redundancy, great. Like we have a way to handle errors. And you shut it down. At least that's how they designed the system, right? Like kick off the backup unit, shut down this main system because it's faulty. Now you have a backup inertial reference system. What happens when you give the same system the same exact input? It's going to produce the same exact output. It's going to shut down. So now you have no inertial reference system at all. But that's fine. It's just going to raise this error to the flight control system. At this point, we've already launched, so it's fine. We can catch this error and keep going. But the main problem is, like, while it was raising the error, the flight control system actually just assumed it was always going to get integer input. But instead, it gave it like an exception that it like processed as an ASCII like binary, which basically means when you convert this to this ASCII value, it's a really, really, really big number. So that's fine. It knows how to handle. It was like, oh, we're going really fast right now. So you want to overcompensate. It's like, okay, to really get to where I need to go, all I have to do is tilt the rocket by 90 degrees to compensate for this incredible speed. So what happens when you have a rocket launching and you do this, right? Like you go from this to like, oof. So at this point, like the gravitational forces are pulling apart the hull, and it's starting to turn into ballistic missile going to someone's backyard. And so the self-destruct program, the self-destruct program works perfectly fine, perfectly fine. Like it works so well, and it blows it up. So that's the sequence of events that caused the explosion. But we're talking about rocket scientists here. Like they kind of know what they're doing. They're not like it's not like a 3-person startup. No offense to the 7 billion of funding, right? Like they and the first thing you can say like, oh well, you know, these sort of exceptions you can catch them by running static analysis. Adam's next talk is going to be or actually, I don't know if you're talking, it's probably not about, but Adam works at a static analysis company. Anyway, so they ran static analysis tools, and they found potential buffer and integer overflows in the inertial reference system. They found them. Now, very quickly in static analysis, what are you trying to do? Is it's not like a comprehensive review. It's just like one part of security. It's like, you know, we can't really assess singular components to make the whole system, like everything has to work well together. But so this is just one thing you have to do, and you're looking at the code line by line. It's pattern matching, and you're trying to find patterns that could be bad. A good example is like cipher mode suites. Like you can detect easily because it's pattern matching. Like, oh, ECB is bad, GCM is good, use that. But one thing static analysis can do is like maybe you shouldn't be using encryption at all. Maybe you should be using hashing in this case. Like that doesn't have enough context yet. Another like common challenge in static analysis is like often security teams like they'll just run the tool and you have like 86,000 or million findings and you give it to the developers and you're like good luck, and then they just ignore you forever because like who's gonna fix 86? So like you're supposed to triage and you know understand their constraints and work with. And so here, what were the constraints of the rocket scientists? They fixed 4 of the 7. 3 were unfixed. Why? Because they looked at their assumptions, they looked at the design, they checked their assumptions, they met with the partners, and they realized like for those 3, they will never overflow based on the assumptions we made. And the reason, I mean, it's easy you can just add one if statement. It's a bounds check, right? Why don't you just add it anyway? And so apparently they wanted to target the max CPU utilization of 80%, and on the rocket, like your iPhone is 100 times faster than the CPU that was on the rocket. So actually, like every single detail mattered there. They were really trying to optimize it a lot. Another part of it is this was partially production testing in a way. So they did some rough tests, but their tests were a bit generic. They didn't really simulate the whole trajectory of that particular launch. Also, some of the testing for a rocket is just really expensive. Other than like virtual testing, if you wanted to actually have a smaller launch, it's just expensive to build like a testing harness for it and everything. And in a way, the first launch was in itself a test. It was like some like academics at the university were trying to launch a satellite. I mean, it destroyed their satellites, but you know, it wasn't there were no people on board. So when they're designing the software, they had taken the assumptions of when you run into an exception, you log the exception, and you shut down the hardware. They assume that any error they run into is because of a hardware failure, which was, I guess, more common back then. But that's just the design assumption they made. Like if you run into a hardware failure, there's no point in continuing to use that hardware because it's faulty hardware. So shut it down and use the backup, and hopefully the backup is not faulty hardware, so everything should be fine. Which means that the assumption was like it's blaming the hardware, but not the actual software itself. It was like kind of like assumed to be correct. And that was part of it. Like unless their design philosophy was unless proven necessary, we don't have to change anything. We're moving software components from the Ariane 4 to the Ariane 5. If they worked previously well, then there's no reason to change them. The saddest part is that the inertial reference system only calibrates before liftoff. So why was it running after liftoff? And that was another thing in the Ariane 4. If sometimes like right at the time of liftoff, there's like a cloud. There's, for some reason you want to like delay the thing, and so if the inertial reference system was shut down, it takes it like an hour to start back up. And so they were like, let's just keep it running for like 40 seconds at the time of liftoff, just in case last minute we need to restart it. But the Ariane 5 did not have this issue. The system could restart instantly. So they had no reason at all to keep it running during liftoff. They should have just shut it down at the time of liftoff. So it was completely a useless piece of software running after the rocket launched. Now after after the incident happened, which by the way they had like really good like a post-mortem report that's super interesting to read, and they were like super serious about it. But they also simulated the launch, more thorough testing. They gave it like the exact trajectory coordinates of this specific launch, and it found the bug. It actually triggered the same integer overflow, and which means they could have caught it earlier if they had tested more. So in that post-mortem report, that's super interesting. They say that it was basically specification and design errors that caused the explosion due to not enough analysis and testing. The exception occurred was not due to random hardware failure, but to a design error. And they say that it was detected, but inappropriately handled exception, because the view had been taken that software should be considered correct until it is shown to be faulty. And this slide, I want to frame it like it's so good. Again, 1996, they said now that the board is in favor of the opposite view, that software should be assumed to be faulty until applying the currently accepted best practice methods can demonstrate that it is correct. Really interesting. 1996, we've learned nothing. No, I'm kidding. We've learned a little bit. We learned, but and well, you could also ask like, okay, but like, how do I demonstrate that it's correct? And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But one thing to keep in mind is this was the first launch of the Ariane 5, and that was the only hardware software failure. And actually, like, it operated from 1996 to 2023 last year, and was operated like perfect. Like, was working so well. It actually launched the James Webb Space Telescope. And actually, only 2 months ago, they launched the Ariane 6, which is not the airplane, but the little thing. And yeah, the Ariane 6 first launch was great. No explosions. So overall, what caused the explosion? So it was wrong design decisions, undocumented assumptions, software reuse, unnecessary legacy code, lack of testing, mishandled exceptions, and an integer overflow. All of those together happens to all of us. So a quick note on like how do you demonstrate that software is correct, though? There's this man, Kurt Gödel, and so he has his incompleteness theorems, basically saying that in some systems, some statements are undecidable, that you cannot prove or disprove them within the system. And so when you're trying to assess an external statement, like if something's a lie externally, again, oh, if it's a lie, my nose grows. If it's not, then, you know. But then the paradox that he found was when it's self-reference. So if Pinocchio says, like, my nose will now grow, if it doesn't grow, then he's lying, so it would grow, but then he wouldn't have been lying. So I think it will grow and shrink repeatedly very quickly, but yeah. So Alan Turing took that and extended it to his halting problem, which basically he's saying like, oh, for a given software, if you give it input in other software, I can never tell if it actually halts at any point or not. And so my assumption is that like if I assume a software that doesn't halt is not secure, then how can I ever prove that software is secure? Let's say a software that doesn't halt causes like denial of service. Like then like I can never truly prove that software is secure. And going back to like formal verification from the White House, so like we have these big limitations, other than like the impracticality of actually proving something. So I think what should be added is like just check the assumptions, right? Like in this case, if they had the rocket people, if they had documented all of their assumptions and read them, saying like, oh, we assume that the maximum velocity during launch should be like X amount, then that's something that would have more easily been caught. Kind of like just like slowing down, writing things down, checking your assumptions over and over, part of threat modeling. We sometimes over-rely on tools or like what language are you using, or but sometimes like the errors that happen here, none of them were specific to the language or the platform or the tools or the details, right? It was just like design assumptions. And so can I write secure code in your favorite language? Yeah, I'm sure you can. I'm sure we can make it work. I think like I think one last slide is that Bjorn Strautstrup had a really interesting talk last year at CPPCon, and he said that when obviously he was like livid at the White House. No, I'm kidding. Like, but like he obviously prefers C++ over Rust because he invented it. But he said that it's easy to say Rust is secure now and it solves all of your problems when all you have is like passion projects, people like writing small passion projects because like they really like it. They're gonna spend extra time and effort, make sure everything's correct. But when you have like enterprise software written by thousands of people who hate their job, who don't even want to be there, then like how do you like I guess that's what C++ is now. Like anyway, so document your assumptions, validate them with tests. It might explode, it's still okay. Like I'm just kidding. It's not okay if it explodes, okay? But my point here is that the first launch that they did was in itself a test, right? And that ended up being the most successful rocket launch ever, or like this rocket series ever. So it's fine. We'll be fine. Thank you.